On October 7, 1944, the inmates of the infamous concentration camp, Auschwitz-Birkenau, staged an uprising. They were the sonderkommando, the prisoners selected by the Nazi SS guards, given the grim task of disposing of the bodies of their fellow countrymen and Jews alike, after being gassed. In an act of revolt, they intended to sabotage and destroy the 4 crematoriums of Birkenau and escape into the forest. But nothing had gone to plan that day. Auschwitz was converted into a prisoner of war camp shortly after the invasion of Poland by Germany in 1939. Almost from its very beginnings, a Polish resistance operated within its electrified perimeter fences, known as Kampfgruppe Auschwitz, consisting initially of medical and administrative prisoners as they survived the longest. This group would grow, and eventually the Sonderkommando would become one of its primary components. Kampfgruppe Auschwitz started laying plans for a camp-wide revolt, with support from the Polish underground in 1943. It would take a year to gather the supplies and weapons needed for the summer of 1944 operation, with the Sonderkommando featuring heavily in their plans. Auschwitz concentration camp is divided into 3 main sections. Auschwitz I, Stammlager, Auschwitz II, Birkenau, and Auschwitz III, Monowitz. During the first 2 years of operation, only Auschwitz I existed and housed mainly prisoners of war. In August of 1941, Auschwitz I initiated use of the gas chambers and crematorium to murder and dispose of the first prisoners. The next month, construction began on the death camp, Auschwitz II, Birkenau. From 1942 to late 1944, over 1.1 million people would die here, primarily in its gas chambers. The bodies then burned to ash in its 4 crematoriums. However, it wasn't the Nazis that did the work. Instead, using mostly Jews from the prisoner population, the Sonderkommando. Initially labeled as conspirators and supporters of the Nazi regime, these men were selected by the SS doctors to guide their fellow inmates and new arrivals into the gas chambers. Then once dead, to take their bodies to the crematoriums. In return, they received better accommodation, isolated from the rest of the camp, as well as more food and supplies. Others felt they sold their souls for a better bed and meal. This couldn't be further from the truth. If they had rejected being selected by the SS for Sonderkommando duty, they would have been nixed into the gas chambers. Birkenau had been built to house 4 crematoria, numbers 2 through 5. The first being already built in Auschwitz I, but retired when Birkenau came online. New prisoners would arrive at the railway station and be separated, sorted, and led to the changing rooms. Here, the Sonderkommando would help them undress in preparation for the gas chambers. They were given numbers and hooks to store their clothing and items, but this was a ruse meant to keep them calm in the belief that they were merely going for a shower. The Sonderkommando had no choice but to play along and to escort their fellow inmates into the gas chambers. They'd hurry them along, telling them they needed to be deloused and that the tea or shower water would get cold if they weren't quick. The SS would then take over, dropping pellets of Zyklon B from the roof or ports in the sides of the room. Zyklon B was a cyanide-based pesticide, which the Nazis had soon learned could kill large groups of people within 2 to 5 minutes. In other camps, they had used exhaust gases. Once the screaming stopped, the Sonderkommando removed the now purple bodies and loaded them into the crematoriums for burning. With the assistance of the Polish underground, the camp inmates planned to stage a camp-wide revolt in June of 1944. Power to the camp was to be cut, stopping the guards within the camp from calling for reinforcements from outside, and also resulting in electric fences being disabled. They could then cut through the perimeter, allowing the prisoners to escape, while the Sonderkommando would sabotage the gas chambers and crematoriums, stopping or delaying the mass executions. Some weapons were able to be purchased from the Polish underground, using gold and other valuable items recovered from executed prisoners, and then the weapons were smuggled into the camp. But what was far more dangerous was the stealing of supplies from within the German factories. Women like Rosa Robota coordinated with other female inmates to acquire and smuggle gunpowder to the Sonderkommando. From within the Krupp factory, small amounts of 1 to 3 teaspoons of the powder were passed between the women before eventually being used to prepare makeshift grenades intended to destroy the crematoriums. Robota, Alla Gertner, Esther Weitzblum, Regina Safferstein were captured after the revolt and severely tortured by the Gestapo. None of the 4 ever gave up the names of the others involved in the revolt. All 4 women were hung on the 6th of January. Their last words? Nekama. Revenge. As the date for the revolt moved closer, news was coming in from the Eastern Front that the Russians were advancing towards Poland and ultimately Germany. The tide of the war had changed against the Nazis. The Polish underground pushed to delay the revolt, choosing to wait for the Red Army to arrive and join the fight. But every day that passed, thousands more were dying in the gas chambers. By September of 1944, the plans had been pushed back 3 months, and there is even talk of canceling them altogether. If the revolt failed, they knew the reprisals from the SS troops would be terrible. The organization and administration of the concentration and death camps lied under the control of the SS, the Schutzstaffel, a paramilitary organization within the Nazi regime associated with some of the greatest war crimes committed by Germany in World War II. Amongst the many subgroups under the SS umbrella organization was the Totenkopfverbände, the Death's Head units. These divisions were charged with the operation of the concentration camps, having been indoctrined with the belief that the prisoners under their charge were subhuman. This led to depravity and an utter lack of human compassion. They routinely beat, tortured, and murdered the inmates for the smallest of infractions. Many of their commanders, including the infamous Rudolf Höss, who ran Auschwitz, showed no remorse after being captured at the end of the war. He operated his camp with ruthless efficiency and total abandonment of morality. The Sonderkommando by now were becoming impatient as to when the uprising would happen. They knew the Russians were approaching, but the sheer number of murders occurring at the camp had reached astronomical figures due to the German invasion of Hungary. Prior to March 1944, they had been an ally, but Hitler, suspecting the Hungarians were looking to exit the war on the side of the Allies, ordered their occupation. Shortly after, the mass deportation of Hungarian Jews to Auschwitz began. In all, over 430,000 Hungarian Jews were sent to Auschwitz, 80% of them being immediately gassed upon arrival. This was far beyond the capacity of the crematoriums, so the SS started burning the bodies outside. By now, rumors were rampant as to what was actually going on inside these death camps. Though the Nazis tried to conceal the mass murders and cover their tracks, foreign governments were already aware of what was happening, but little to no physical evidence existed. This led to a series of 4 photos being taken, known as the Sonderkommando photographs, and are unique as they are the only pictures ever taken of prisoners in a death camp being executed. The extreme risk and courage in taking these pictures cannot be undersold. A camera was smuggled into the camp from the Polish underground, resulting in 4 pictures being hastily taken. As can be seen, they were mostly shot from the hip as there was no time to properly line up the camera. The first picture, number 282, shows a group of undressed women being hastily driven into the gas chamber. Following this picture, likely 30 to 45 minutes later, are pictures 280 and 281. The bodies being burnt in the open air. Picture 283 shows the top of trees, due to the photographer's rushed state. Though it doesn't show anything of the genocide, it's instrumental in showing how rushed and dangerous it was to acquire these pictures. The film was later smuggled out inside a tube of toothpaste. Amongst the other photographic records of the time is the Auschwitz album. a series of 193 photographs taken by the SS during the same period of the Hungarian Jew deportations. It primarily serves as a record of identification for prisoners arriving and being put to work. As well, it displays the arrivals of the trains from Hungary and the organization and selection of works and executions. In stark contrast to these photographic records lies the Hocker album, taken by SS officer Karl Friedrich Hocker. It presents the officers and administrators, in relaxation mostly. These men and women who oversaw countless deaths and barbaric torture somehow appear untroubled in their personal lives. Survivors from the Sonderkommando also stated that they themselves became dull and separated from their jobs. For them, it was the only way to survive. Many of the pictures are taken at Sola Hütte, a resort for the officers a short way from Auschwitz. In this remarkable picture, we see Bear, the final commander of Auschwitz. In the middle is Joseph Mengele, the infamous Angel of Death, known for his bizarre and deadly experiments on inmates. On the right, Rudolf Höss, the longest-serving commander of Auschwitz and who was instrumental in the introduction of the poison gas, Zyklon B. By September 1944, things had changed. Fewer and fewer trains were starting to come into Auschwitz. The summer's mass executions of Hungarian Jews had slowed to a trickle as the German forces were being pushed back home. By now, the Nazis knew the end was coming and they had to cover their tracks. The Sonderkommando had been periodically executed as a matter of policy. The SS didn't want anyone with knowledge of what actually happened in these camps to be rescued and to provide evidence to the Allied forces. This often left new Sonderkommando replacements with the grisly job of disposing of the bodies of their predecessors. Shortly after the inflow of new Jews slowed, the SS announced 300 Sonderkommando were to be relocated to another camp. They weren't, instead being executed by gunshot. The surviving Sonderkommando knew what happened and understood their time was short. They learned that the SS planned to relocate a further 300 Sonderkommando, so without being able to contact the other resistance groups, they planned a revolt for October 7th. However, on the night of October 6th, the SS guards had already become suspicious. Kaminski, one of the leaders of the Sonderkommando, was interrogated by SS officer Otto Moll. When he refused to give any information or names, he was shot. Nothing was going to plan for the Sonderkommando. The planned uprising had been scheduled for 4 p.m. that evening, during the roll call. In an unexpected turn of events, SS soldiers showed up at Crematorium IV and V at 12 p.m., gathering prisoners for deportation. With their plans falling apart, the Sonderkommando of these two units had a choice to make: go quietly and end any plans for revolt, or rise up now and begin the fight. They chose the latter. They stormed the guards with whatever they had available: poles, knives, anything on hand. The guards started shooting indiscriminately as they tried to subdue the attack. Across the camp, at crematoriums 2 and 3, the Sonderkommando units were caught off guard when they saw the explosion at number 4. The revolt had started too soon. They weren't ready. The men at number 2 joined the fight, using whatever weapons they had available to attack their SS guards. The crematoriums that had before held the bodies of their own people would now be turned against their enemies. They had been designed for burning 2 bodies at a time within 30 minutes, with Crematorium 2 having a maximum 24-hour capacity of 1,440 people. But during its peak, they loaded 3 to 5 people at a time. Now, the SS would feel its heat, being burnt alive. Back at number 4, the Sonderkommando ran back inside and set the building ablaze. It wasn't long before the grenades and gunpowder they had hidden in the walls ignited, sending the entire building crumbling to the ground. Number 5 nearby was also damaged in the explosion. Crematorium IV stood down, as the SS was waiting outside to mow them down. The chance had passed them, but the men in number 2 were now cutting through the fence and making their escape into the surrounding forests. As quickly as it had started, it was over. Approximately 250 sonderkommando were killed during the Battle of the Crematoriums, with about 80 from crematorium number 2 escaping. Many of them hid in a granary in the nearby village of Reiskow, but it wasn't long before they were found. They lit the granary on fire and let it burn down with the men inside. Motorized SS units mowed down men fleeing, but about 27 of them managed to survive until the end of the war. Another 200 sonderkommando were executed following the events, leaving 105 alive. They tortured and beat them until the last few names were revealed, including Rosa Robota, who hung to death shortly thereafter. The remaining surviving sonderkommando were tasked with disposing of all the bodies. The war was coming to a close. By the end of October, the crematoriums were permanently shuttered. The remaining sonderkommando were now used to dismantle the crematoriums and destroy any evidence of their existence. Even then, these men chose to rebel, sabotaging and delaying the process. They also wrote notes, letters, and kept stored and labeled ashes of family members, burying them just under the surface to be easily found by the approaching Red Army. They would make sure the world knew what happened here. By January 1945, the camp was being abandoned. The German forces were pulling back to Germany as the Russians arrived. Still trying to cover up evidence, they lined up the remaining prisoners and ordered the sonderkommando to step out, so they could be executed, erasing the last traces of genocide. They didn't. And instead, all remaining healthy prisoners began the death march to Germany, many not surviving. These men, branded as conspirators and greedy traitors, were anything but. Can you imagine being forced day in and day out to lie and lead your fellow man to their death, as it was the most humane thing you could do? They even were faced with their own family members, wives, sons, mothers, being able to do nothing but point them to the gas chamber, only to then recover their lifeless bodies and feed them to the incinerator. In all, over 6 million Jews were murdered during World War II, over 1 million in Auschwitz-Birkenau alone, an event to never be repeated again. I hope you enjoyed this video. If so, please subscribe.